Well, order, and welcome to the second of the three sessions that we're holding as a committee to scrutinise last week's budget from the Chancellor. We heard from the Office for Budget Responsibility this morning. We're hearing from the Chancellor tomorrow. But we have a great panel of witnesses this afternoon. I'm going to start by asking you to introduce yourselves. Professor.
Arun Advani from the University of Warwick.
Thank you. Paul.
Paul Johnson, Institute for Fiscal Studies.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yael Selfin, Chief Economist at KPMG.
Torsten from the Resolution Foundation.
Thank you very much. And Professor, we have you here because you're an expert on the tax system, as we understand. My first question is going to be more on the sort of macro side of things. So we heard from the Office for Budget Responsibility this morning, and I just wanted to start by asking each of the three economists where you differ the most from the forecasts that the Office for Budget Responsibility has put out there. Paul.
I don't think I've got a particular answer to that in terms of forecasts. We don't do our own macroeconomic forecasts. I mean, on the fiscal forecasts, because they've been forced to assume unlikely things like the fuel duty rising and spending being held very tight, I expect their fiscal forecasts are more optimistic than is a central expectation, but that's not down to a difference about macroeconomic outcomes. That's
your main difference is that you think tax will be a bit lower and spending will be a bit higher. Is that your main point of difference with what has been published by the OBR?
Yes, I think, and the bigger of those will be spending, probably. So I think, as I say, I think their forecasts are not a central expectation, but that's not their fault. That's because that's what they have to do.
We heard from them this morning that they say that public sector productivity is very key and that public sector productivity is still lower than it was in 2019, and that the difference between, if we just were to get public sector productivity up to that level again, that would be worth billions and billions in terms of productivity from the public sector. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, it'd certainly be good to get it there, and we know that health productivity, for example, isn't where it needs to be, but you actually need to get it there just to start getting the waiting lists down. So, of course, it's better to have higher productivity than lower, but I don't think that will massively reduce the pressure for spending. It's worth saying, actually, in terms of the macro forecast, one thing they continue to do is to say they think that economy-wide productivity will grow halfway between where it was pre-financial crisis and since. So you could argue that that's quite optimistic. But I think on the public sector productivity element, yes, we need it. Yes, it would help, but I'm less convinced that would make the scale of cashable savings that would make that would mean that we really kept the numbers that are published.
I know we'll have further questions on the NHS productivity plan this afternoon, but Yael, as a private sector economist, where did your forecast differ most from the ones we saw from the Office for Budget Responsibility?
So our focus of inflations are broadly in line with the OBR. Where we differ is GDP growth forecast. It's partially because their input in terms of the Q4 numbers and the revision to the data wasn't taken into account in the current forecast, whereas we had the ability to incorporate that. But the bulk of it is really because our expectation for productivity growth is lower than the OBR.
So you've got slightly you're above the Bank of England but below the Office for Budget Responsibility in terms of productivity growth.
Give you an example. Our forecasts at the moment are for GDP growth of 0.1% in 2024, 0.9% in 2025, and 1% in 2026 versus 0.8, 1.9 and 2 for the OBR latest forecast.
Okay. And Torsten, yourself?
I don't have loads to add to those. I think those are highlighting the kind of the key areas where the OBR looks a bit out of whack. The productivity forecast is basically assuming this economy gets growing again in a way it hasn't over the pre-pandemic decade. I definitely hope that's true, but and the gap between the Bank of England and the OBR's growth forecast is probably the largest it's been Definitely in terms of a sustained fashion in which they've got it in. It's a very large gap. The Bank of England are incredibly pessimistic, hopefully again far too pessimistic, and the OBR are far more optimistic than anyone else within the private sector
and
forecast world.
Productivity assumptions are the key.
Most of that is being driven by productivity assumptions. Some of it is when people have updated their population stats, but mainly it's about productivity differences, and definitely between the Bank of England and the OBR it is.
Okay, so then same question on inflation, because there was again quite a meaningful difference between what the OBR is forecasting, that it will be below 2% by the end of the year, and the Bank of England's got it falling but then rising again to 3% by the end of the year. What's driving that then? The difference, and your views as well as organisations.
One, I should say, is quite a lot of uncertainty. So I think either is a reasonable forecast. Personally, I would prefer the Office of Budget Responsibilities forecast as a more likely central scenario, but we should say they're very uncertain. The Bank of England's is to some degree, their forecast is fitting a story which is interest rates aren't going to come down as fast as markets are expecting, and because they're not, and because what they've put in there, then have to have inflation bouncing back up again. On the substance, what actually matters is what you think is going to happen to the stickiness of wage growth. If you look at what's actually happening in the data, we've got different things pointing in different directions. We have a very high level of nominal wage growth in today's day before survey you'll have seen, roughly around 6%. If you look at the shorter term wage growth numbers, we've got quite a fast slowing going on, but again, that's within AWE, and that doesn't quite match up with what we are being told by firms in terms of their
earnings. Is that
average weekly earnings?
Yeah.
But we're there seeing, they've fallen very fast. There's been hardly any growth in private sector pay in the average weekly earnings since the summer. Now, companies in other necks of the woods, if you look at what the Bank of England's agents, for example, are reporting, are saying that they're still expecting to pay 5% this year. If that is what happens, then you've got a problem, and the Bank of England forecast maybe looks more plausible. But as I say, AWE shows it falling to below 3% in terms of the shorter term pay growth. So let's hope that is what actually happens.
Okay. Yael?
If I could just add to that, there's one element of the output gap, essentially the excess capacity that is still available in the economy, whereby the OBR is expecting fairly significant slack, much more than the Bank of England and more than we expect at the moment, and that means that inflation could go further down below the Bank of England target by more than what the Bank of England or we expect in the medium term. And that is partially driven by the assumption of stronger productivity that is building that additional capacity in the economy.
Now, Paul, you've described the Chancellor's fiscal rule as quote-unquote bizarre. What would you think would be a better fiscal rule?
Well, no fiscal rule is perfect. And I should say, the one thing that the current fiscal rule has done, it has constrained how much he's been able to do this time round. So I think that's positive. In a world in which he wasn't constrained at all, he might have done more to provide pre-election giveaways, but he was constrained by his fiscal rule, and of course it's bizarre because of it's just about debt coming down in the fifth year of the forecast period. I think there are two ways you could go. One is to have a more qualitative rule where you've got the Chancellor says that my aim is to get debt down into the medium term, and then you get the OBR each time to say whether they think that is happening, whether they think the direction of policy is consistent with that qualitative rule. And I think there's quite a lot to be said for something like that, particularly when you have got, you obviously couldn't do that if you didn't have an independent OBR, but with an independent OBR, then you can do something along those lines. Otherwise, you are otherwise you're always in the game, as it were, of having specific numerical rules where something of the form that we've had in the past, which is less forward-looking, so not looking at where things are going in 5 years, but maybe looking at 3 years, and is looking still at getting at debt falling between now and the end of that period, or at that point. The problem at the moment is, the current fiscal rule is, I think, just about the loosest we've had. So any rule of that numerical kind that you put in its place would be even more constraining than the one we've got, because of course debt is actually rising over the next 3 or 4 years. And that pretty much any other rule, I think, you would have had less flexibility than you've got at the moment.
Indeed, but what I'm hearing there is that the Institute for Fiscal Studies, you're not campaigning for a particular different fiscal rule.
Not a specific one. I do think there's quite a lot to be said for moving to something more qualitative.
Would that reassure the financial markets, do you think, Yael? I mean, it sounds slightly hazy and grey, and this time the bond markets were stable after this budget.
Yes, but I agree with Paul that it is really much more about the substance and the overall credibility of the spending plans and the future further along the horizon. And therefore the rules themselves are less of the issue. It's more
credibility of the thinking that's got to them to that forecast, yeah. And in that context, you're not suggesting any change to the fiscal rule either.
I mean, I agree with Paul that these are not the ideal rules. I think there could be others that would be would give the Chancellor more room to look at the longer term horizon and really address some of the key issues that we have in the UK economy, like boosting productivity. So trying to prioritize the implication of spending in the longer term and what would boost longer term prospects for the UK economy is really important. And I'm not sure whether the current set is the best for that.
And Torsten, in terms of the fiscal rules that we have, the fiscal rules that all chancellors are always likely to want to have some version of them, can you envisage any fiscal rule that would ever bring debt down to the kind of levels that we saw before the pandemic as a percentage of the economy?
So, I mean, it's not really a fiscal rule. That's can I imagine, a fiscal policy that brings debt down. I think that's what we should really distinguish between. There's a lot of discussion about rules, but what we really care about is what the actual fiscal policy is, what we actually do. That is what in the end markets care about, rather than, is your policy credible? You can remember Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister have both had the same fiscal rule, but markets believe one and not the other, and the reason is because the fiscal policy is what matters, not the fiscal rule. We're not in the short term under either main party's current proposal going to bring debt remotely. We're not going to bring it down at all, let alone bring it down to where it was before the pandemic, or before it was certainly before the financial crisis. I mean, yes, the forecasts show a fall in debt between 2 years at the back end of the period, but partly for the reasons Paul was laying out, which is that there's some optimism bias in the assumptions that have been put into those forecasts. You're not going to have debt falling. But secondly, because stuff happens, and even if you did have it falling in that individual year, we know a recession turns up roughly once every 10 years. It costs you enough in terms of a share of GDP added to your debt stock that your debt will not be on a downward trajectory with this current fiscal policy. So all else equal, there's a bit of a weird thing at the moment, which is lots of people are criticising the fiscal rule. What they really mean is they think fiscal policy is too tight. That's what, if you watch commentators who are commentating ahead of the Chancellor's appearance on Laura Kuenssberg's show, that they were all saying, we don't like this rule, it's too constraining. But the truth is, we've got a very loose fiscal policy, for exactly as Paul said. Debt isn't falling. It's not falling even on the basis of these forecasts, really, and it definitely isn't once you take into account that the world gets messy. So the long answer, no, not on the current fiscal policies you're talking about. In terms of the actual fiscal rules themselves, the 5 year focus is definitely silly. So whatever you think about anything else in the rules, in normal times, if you think the goal is to have debt falling, and I'll come on to whether it should be debt falling in a second, but if you think it should be debt falling, then you need a rule that basically requires you to have debt falling in every year outside of a recession and the recovery from that recession, not just 5 years out, because that's a rule to never have debt falling. Secondly, the fact that the consensus in British politics is that we should focus fiscal rules in ways that don't take any account of the difference between investment and current spending is causing us big problems. And that's why whenever a downturn happens or just bad news happens, we cut public sector investment. That's what's going on right now. That is definitely bad for the country in the long run. We're definitely moving into a phase where we have to be investing more rather than less. Net zero on its own would be enough to require that, but so would lots of other things. Lots of other people and other, some parts of British politics would like a lot more investment spending on defence. The bombs are capital spending. The nukes we're building are capital spending. So you're going to need more capital spending in future. So the fiscal rules are driving us to a perverse outcome. I don't think the Chancellor thinks that's a good thing. It's just where politics and the fiscal rules have taken us. Fixing that isn't totally straightforward. So we should definitely get rid of the rule we don't talk about anymore because it never binds. We shouldn't have a overall borrowing target. We should have a current budget balance target that only looks at current spending versus current taxation. That's, I think, generally accepted, but that isn't making a difference to the fiscal policy at the moment because it's not the rule that is biting. On debt, it is harder. So that one, I think, is all reasonable people should probably think we should get rid of that borrowing target and replace it with a current budget target. Debt is more complicated, which is, in a perfect world, you would prefer have a net worth target than a net debt target that takes into account the value of assets the public sector holds. That is harder to do in practice because of the valuation of those assets and indeed of your liabilities. Public sector pensions is a case in point. So you'd have to do that carefully. I would probably be looking at both debt and net worth to come to a rounded view of what's happening to the public sector balance sheet, but that's where you would look to be moving towards.
And I think, Professor Advani, you wanted to just add something here.
Yeah, actually, Torsten picked up the 2 points I was going to make, which are, firstly, I would agree with everything Paul said in terms of I prefer a qualitative test than a quantitative test. The OBR standing up and saying this does or doesn't look, or this is how likely we think it is to look consistent with whatever our overall strategy is better than having a tick box exercise that leads any Chancellor to want to directly game it and get just under the target. But if we're going to have a fiscal target, I think the two things which Torsten picked up both of are firstly making sure that it's a target that covers all of the years rather than just the fifth year, because the downside of the current rule is we can increase debt every single year as long as we have it declining in that fifth year, and that looks okay. And clearly that's not consistent with what any of us would think is the goal that's behind this kind of rule. The second thing is we shouldn't think that investment is free and can be done unlimitedly separately, but we probably shouldn't have it directly in the same target. We should think about it separately because, exactly as Torsten said, the current system encourages Chancellors, when it comes to the crunch, to say, all right, I'll cut the capital spend so that I can afford a bit more of the current spend. And that will happen year after year. And so if we're going to make sure that there's scope for investment, and if the point of the rule is to encourage good policy, good long-term thinking, then we need to make sure we have some way in which that investment is being thought about separately from the current spend directly, rather than something that can just be hidden away together and all the money getting moved over into current spend every time we get to a crunch.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I do want to talk about departmental spending plans and the impact on public services. So perhaps I could start with Paul and Torsten with this. We had Richard Hughes from the OBR, and he's previously told the Lords Finance Committee on the fiscal forecast. I think I'll quote him. Some people have referred to that as a work of fiction. That is probably generous given that someone has bothered to write the work of fiction, whereas the government have not even bothered to write down their departmental spending plans. And he's stuck by those comments this morning. Is there sufficient clarity on the government's future departmental spending plans at this fiscal event?
I mean, there isn't clarity. I mean, the Chancellor was very clear that we're not going to get a spending review until after the election, which is a shame, because that means there's nothing for any of the parties to base what they're saying on. So it's easy to say spending will rise by 1% a year after the election if you're giving no sense of where that spending will be. Now, as you'll have seen, our calculations, OBR's calculations and other people show pretty clearly that on quite conservative assumptions about what's going to happen to defence and health spending and so on, that will mean cuts across, if you take that seriously, cuts across the rest of public services, and especially when you take account of this on a per person basis, because of course the population is growing here.
I do want to come back to that in a second and concentrate on that issue, but is there could the government give any more clarity given the spending review that's not been undertaken?
It could do a spending review before the election. I mean, in normal times we would expect a spending review in the summer-autumn, kicking in from April 2025. And so whether you call, I mean, given the uncertainty around an election, you might think that's a slightly odd thing to do, but I do think, first of all, departments will want to know what they're expecting to spend from April 2025, and if we don't have an election right till the end of this year and then a spending review, that's going to give them very little chance to prepare. But I think more importantly is this point about transparency and accountability. And I think, in a sense, my sense is that both of the main parties are probably going to hide behind the fact that there's nothing saying what's going to happen to the justice budget, what's going to happen to the local government budget, and so on, not so that we don't get the real difficult trade-offs really discussed. And of course, this is in the context of, and you'll have seen the Institute for Government work showing that virtually all public services are doing worse than they were in 2019, when they were doing worse than they were in 2010, for instance, as well as the fact that the areas that are likely to grow, defence and health and so on, the ones that aren't going to grow or that are at risk are exactly the ones that had significant cuts in the 2010s.
Well, as I say, I want to come on to that again, but I'm hearing from you that they should have, and they haven't, and that's an issue.
I would very much like them to indicate at least how would they make the sums add up. They've given us the total, so what is their proposal for meeting that envelope? And that could be a formal spending review, or it could be something that comes out in a manifesto, for example. But it will be, I think, in the interest of transparency, given that we've got these total numbers, I think there's a very strong case for us to be told how the government intends to make the individual bits add up to the total.
Torsten?
So I agree with all of that. In terms of democracy, you'd obviously like to know more. I think in terms of actually administering the public sector, then is definitely deeply suboptimal that we won't even get a one-year spending review for 25-26. So say we have, for example, a late October election, that means whoever is the Chancellor after the election has got to deliver a spending review basically within a matter of 5 or 6 weeks. You've really got to have done it by the first week of December, because you don't just need to give departments their budgets, you have to do the spending review, give departments their budgets, and they then need time to do, for example, the local government settlement and the school settlement. Otherwise, if we're leaving it later than that, we are at serious risk of running into the start of the financial year without having given schools and councils budgets. If you do that kind of thing, you can't be surprised when you get bad value for money, so there's a concrete, this is not, I'm agreeing with Paul on the high and mighty transparency and democracy. I'd like democracy to be well informed, you all should go and inform it. But for people running public services right now, not doing at least a one-year spending review if we're having an election in the autumn is a very bad thing indeed.
Well, let's drill down on that and what Paul was saying a second ago. The OBR has stated that, and I quote, meeting existing commitments on health, defence, schools, childcare and overseas aid spending would imply a real cut in all other departmental budgets of 2.3% per year from 2025-26. What particular departments, in your views, are likely to be the big losers here?
Well, the ones they're talking about are the likes of the Ministry of Justice, where you'll have seen, yesterday announced that prisoners are being let out of jail early to make sure that we can manage a prison estate that hasn't had the investment it's needed. Local government is the other absolutely big one. Any of you do?
How bad is it for local government?
Well, we're not going to be able to deliver 13% cut to local government spending power in the next parliament. Sitting within, we're all talking about the tax rises that have been announced in recent years, but one of them that doesn't get discussed because it's not formally set by the Treasury is obviously council tax, which is going up by 5% basically every year forever in these forecasts. Why is that happening? Because have you all met your potholes? I mean, you cannot do a focus group on any topic right now around the country, even if it's got nothing to do with public services or anything, without people raising the potholes. Yeah, I mean, look, and what I'd say is, just as a little side story, on potholes, it's usually brought up as a symbol for the public sector not being able to deliver at all. It's undermining people's faith that anything can get done, and it is actually a real worry.
Yeah, well, I again agree. I mean, if you're looking at other, there are other things that can give. So, for example, the OBR's numbers are predicated on some pretty horrific expectations, for example, on spending on disability benefits. So, what we're talking about here is public service spending and not welfare spending. So, you could reduce the rate at which you increase the state pension. You could find, not easy, some way of controlling the various parts of the welfare budget, and that gives you more room for manoeuvre. But within the public services budget, it's exactly as I was saying, those areas that had the biggest cuts in the 2010s, which were the unprotected areas, which would again, under these scenarios, be the unprotected areas. And the backlogs in the justice system are huge. It's clear that local authorities are struggling. Now, again, with local authorities, you could from the centre just say they've got less in the way of expectations, or that the legal minimum requirements they have for getting special educational need kids to school or whatever. You could, or you reduce the standard of social care. I mean, those are options, but of course they're options which would have really bad social consequences. And in local government, I think something like 2/3 of their budget is going on social care of one kind or another and supporting children
just,
in that way.
Just to underline that, who do you see as the big losers then in this?
Well, I suspect it will be. Well, let me put this. I don't think this is what's going to happen. That's not my central expectation. Whoever wins the next election, I think it's most unlikely that they're going to be imposing 10 to 15% cuts across those services. I think much more likely is either we'll borrow more, or we'll tax more and spend more, or it will get lucky with growth. I genuinely will be surprised, despite the fact, going back to my very first answer, because it's the law, as it were. The OBR has to put this as its central forecast. It is not my central forecast of what will actually happen.
Okay, let me go on to a specific issue then. The government has announced an additional $2.5 billion of day-to-day funding, as they put it, for the NHS in England. They've described as protecting funding levels in real terms and supporting the NHS to continue to improve performance and reduce waiting times. Has the government done enough to put waiting lists on a long-term downwards trajectory?
Well, they've done... Well, you go.
So the 2.5 billion is just enough to stop spending falling between this year and next, and that's because spending was topped up this year. It's being topped up now ahead of time next for 24-25, and will almost certainly be topped up again. Now, there's a interesting sort of game theoretical question about whether that's a sensible way of doing things, because if you offered them more, they'd still come back for top-ups later on. But I mean, it's kind of an illustration of the kind of not very sensible way in which we fund various parts of the NHS. And it's worth saying, within this, in terms of getting waiting lists down, we know that another £1 billion has been moved from capital to current spending this year, which, alongside all of the last decade, is one of the reasons that we're struggling with waiting lists. Now, the longest waiting lists, bits of them are coming down, and on some reasonable assumptions, waiting lists should start to turn the corner over the next few years. But I mean, work that my colleagues have done suggests that on reasonable assumptions, waiting lists will still be higher at the end of the next Parliament than they were pre-COVID. So whilst there is some...
Just on COVID, can the increase in waiting times be solely explained by the pandemic?
Well, I don't think anyone really knows what's created all of this, and that includes, as far as I can tell, NHS England. I mean, there are a number of elements and a number of hypotheses, including that lack of capital that I referred to, the fact that got a lot more staff, but they're less senior on average than they used to be. There clearly are problems getting people out into the social care system. There are still some people in hospital with COVID and all of the isolation and so on that requires. There's some evidence that people are going in with worse health than they used to. But I mean, there are other things. But there's also evidence that GPs are less likely to refer people on into hospital because they know the waiting lists are high, and because they know that hospitals are struggling. And then there are bits of the waiting list which, as it were, aren't even part of the headline waiting list. I mean, the length of wait for cancer treatment. I mean, I was shocked when I realised, just recently on the basis of my colleagues' work, that there's been a remarkable reduction in the number of people with urgent cancer referrals who are actually being treated within 2 months of their referral, even after they've been diagnosed as having cancer. So you've got problems right across the piece there. I think the amount of resource is now such that things will start to move in the right direction, but all of the evidence is that it will move pretty slowly in the right direction.
Does anybody else want to add anything to that? No? Okay.
Thank you very much, Drew. Yeah. Siobhan.
Should I do living standards first, Chair, or
Go for it.
Okay, thank you. I don't know why I'm telling you guys, because I think you know all that I'm gonna be saying to you. The Parliament is on course to be the first in modern history where living standards actually fall. Each household is set to be £250 poorer at its end than they were at its start. The Conservative government between 2015 and 17 has the second worst record on living standards over the course of the Parliament, with a modest improvement of £260. What is it that the government has got wrong that has led to show the slowing in improvement and now fall in living standards?
I mean, the biggest answer is it's really good to avoid pandemics and being in Europe during an energy crisis where gas prices in Europe have obviously gone up considerably. So that's the big things. You may or may not think that the government has control over those. So I thought there's a large thing going on. Within that, household budgets are also being squeezed by taxes rising. Some of those intentionally by policy, and some of those because of wider changes in the economy going on over that phase. In terms of what's happening in the very short term, the answer is that the figures you've read out are certainly right, that this is the first Parliament on record where we should expect to see living standards at a lower level at the end than the beginning. All I would say to balance that is it's not quite as suicidally depressing as it was in the autumn. So the OBR is at least predicting some income growth next year rather than further falls, so that's welcome. But yes, the numbers are still terrible. In terms of whose income is probably growing next year, our projections are that we should be seeing middle and higher income households seeing some income growth next year, because wage growth is now happening in real terms. For poorer households, because the cost of living payments are being brought to an end, the last payment was made in February, and this is obviously a policy choice, but an understandable one, poorer households will probably have lower incomes next year, next financial year that is, than they had this year. And that's a serious situation, because we were already seeing those households struggling. Food bank usage up by 30% over the last few years. So, that's a very difficult situation people are going to be wrestling with this year.
Maybe I'll just add that we have had a relatively healthy labour market, in the sense that unemployment is still relatively low, and that's partly guaranteeing that wage growth remain relatively strong. We're expecting wage growth to moderate a little bit, but to remain well above inflation, and therefore gradually people are recovering their real purchasing power over time, so that should improve. We still expect the higher interest rates to feed into higher mortgage costs over the next couple of years, so that we will have that tightness there. But generally, in the medium term, what's driving it is, again, going back to productivity. We need stronger productivity in order to be able to benefit from higher living standard.
Not a lot to add. I mean, two things I will say is, the national insurance cut in January and in April is big, and that will mean that the tax bill for middle to higher middle income earners will be significantly down, and that will be quite a big boost to living standards for that group, and that for that group very significantly offsets the increase in income tax as a result of the freezing of allowances and thresholds. So that'll be a boost for that particular group. In terms of the period, I think it is, there is a sense that the beginning of the Parliament happened to coincide with, just before when the pandemic hit. Now, if you'd had a Parliament from, say, 2008 to 2013, you'd have had a bigger fall over that period. It just happened we didn't have a Parliament over that period, and I don't think in either case it's likely that government policy would have made a great big difference. So just to be clear, this isn't just because it happened to be who was in government at this time. At least a large part of it is because it happened to be a bad time.
Just to add on that, I think one thing that's worth us reflecting on is, so there's things we control, there's things we don't. There's a general thing which is, the last few years have been really difficult for most European economies. The bit where the UK looks exceptional is the longer term period. It's the 2010 to now period where growth per capita, which is what matters, and productivity growth is much weaker than other. So productivity growth is about half the level in the UK over those whole 14 years that it is across the advanced
Can
economies.
you just clarify, did it start in 2010 or at the financial crisis?
No, the productivity growth probably slightly starts even before the financial crisis, but certainly, the financial crisis is the cause for the start of the slowdown, absolutely. And but the fact that post-financial crisis we don't get any, normally you have a big crash and then you have a faster growth in the recovery phase, if anything, because you've taken the big output hit during the 2008-2009 phase, and instead what we've seen is basically next to no productivity growth, and that is where the UK looks exceptional, rather than, I'd rather be us than Germany right now in lots of ways, whereas I'd rather be Germany looking across the whole 15-year period.
Which brings me to my next question was, in comparison to Australia, Canada, France, Germany and the Netherlands, typical households in the UK are £8,300 worse off. What is it that those countries have got right? Appreciate it may be their energy supply and policy, but what makes them so much more prosperous than the UK? And what is it that this government has got wrong that we're failing so far behind? That's
a Resolution Foundation statistic you're reading out. So behind that sits two things. That's about typical income households. So there's two things going on. There's what's the size of the pie, the GDP per capita that's being shared out, and then there's how unequal they are. The 5 countries you're raising are all more equal than Britain, and so the middle income groups receive a bigger share of those countries' living standards pot to be shared out. And then the second thing is those countries either started richer than us or have grown faster than us over those 15 years, or both. In fact, most cases it's both. And those two things together are giving you higher living standards for the middle class in those other countries.
I just wanted to add one more point about living standard and just looking potentially at other metrics, because when you look at surveys, people appreciate not just the money that they get, but other things like the quality of health, for example, including mental health. And this is potentially one of the other things that we should measure when we talk about living standard and how we compare to other countries, where I'm sure Torsten will be able to share some statistics.
I promise not to.
Any other?
I agree. We're less productive than those countries for the sorts of reasons that we've discussed.
I happen to have been looking at it today, so I would also just highlight housing is just such a catastrophe.
Don't say any more.
Okay.
I've got my next question.
All right. I won't say any more.
I think we'll all agree with you there.
I was just going to add that I definitely agree the way to think about the productivity problem is not the last parliament, it's going back to the financial crisis. I think you could even divide that, though, into two phases. The immediate post-crisis period was a period in which most countries struggled. Most countries' productivity didn't bounce back in the way that we would expect after other recessions. In a way, the thing that's more striking is from the middle of the last decade, we continued to have bad productivity growth and continued not to have wage progression in a way that other countries then started to see it. There are lots of things you can point to. One that economists have often pointed to is Brexit, and I think there's partly not. One part of that is genuinely leaving the EU has made us poorer, but more importantly, even than are we in or are we out, is just the tremendous policy uncertainty we had over that whole period. We've had sort of 5-6 years in which we didn't quite know what was happening. There wasn't a decision, and that makes it very hard for investment to take place from the private sector. We've talked about public sector investment being pretty poor over this period because of the fact that spending is, governments have wanted to constrain spending and they've pushed the money when they had it towards current spend. But it's also the case the private sector hasn't invested, and a big part of that is without certainty over what the policy looks like, it's very hard to make a decision. So whether or not you think in or out is better, not deciding or not being sure what the deal looks like for a long period was certainly worse for the UK, because for that long period nobody could quite be sure what to do. Now we got to the end of the period where we got some certainty exactly when the pandemic started, and so that was another period in which it's been pretty hard for companies to be organised about what they want to plan for the future. I guess the question is now what will happen going forward, and I think the OBR's done its best estimate at these, and others have spoken already about what other predictions for productivity might look like.
One of the surprises to me as an MP in southwest London was that the Chancellor had so little to say about housing, because it's certainly the biggest social problem that I come across. More than a million households are expected this year to come to the end of their cheaper mortgage deals, leading to an average increase of £1,800. Previously, mortgage holders on average had £61 left after paying for essentials, but now, after the mortgage changes, they're likely to find themselves in debt of about £100 a month. And even worse if you're dependent on the private rented sector and the social housing sector. I had a couple come to my advice surgery last Friday who are going to be imminently homeless. The man has an income of £40,000 a year, and there isn't a shared ownership project at the smallest proportion he could buy that he had enough money for. For people in temporary accommodation, we now have 550 families in temporary accommodation. We used to be down at 100. And the council can't cope, and the families can't cope, and we're putting them in accommodation that costs the taxpayer a fortune, and you wouldn't let your pet live in. Why did he have nothing to say?
So there's a number of different things going on within that. In terms of this, so we talk about the housing crisis or housing problems, but there's obviously a number of different ones going on. So you've raised, so certainly with the levels of homelessness we're seeing are very, and homelessness broadly defined, so not just in terms of actual street sleeping, but in terms of temporary accommodation, this are all at absolutely terrible levels. Insofar as policy has a part to play in that, which it does, there's good and bad news. The bad news is, I'm afraid lots of that was predictable, because that's what happens if you freeze the local housing allowance and leave large amounts of families unable to afford their rent over the course of the last few years. The good news, which the Chancellor announced in the autumn statement, so it has had something to say on housing, is that he is reconnecting the local housing allowance to the third of local rents. That comes in a few weeks' time. That is a very significant increase, including in South West London actually, be a very large increase in people's rent support. So that should start to help. I mean, obviously we're in a silly world now where we are basically, we all know we have to let the LHA rise with rent levels. We kind of pretend for 3 years that we can leave it frozen to keep the public finance numbers in the forecast looking okay. Then homelessness starts to build, and then we reconnect it temporarily. That's not a good system to be in. That's at the bottom end of the housing market. Obviously, at the top end, then the mortgage increase is the thing that is really driving concern. But stepping back from both of those, the underlying problem is that in Britain, housing is too expensive. If you look at the cost of housing for those that face housing costs relative to the amount of housing you get, then we are definitely the most expensive place to buy housing in the OECD. If you look at, I was looking at something yesterday which is absolutely staggering. The amount of the size of the home per adult that you get in the UK as a whole, not London, for the UK as a whole, is now less than New York. Okay, that is mad. And that's what happens when we don't build enough houses. The amount of floor space per person in the UK as a whole, obviously in London it's less than New York because you don't have tower blocks everywhere, but for the UK as a whole is now lower than the New York metropolitan area. So not Manhattan, but the New York metropolitan area. That is, we now have less floor space than the Japanese, who famously love tight floor spaces. I mean, and that in the end
is... The population of New York metropolitan area is?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can definitely write you with that because it's going in a book. Okay. But it's terrible and it's terrifying, and the only reason we're getting away with it is because 35% of Britons now own their home outright, so don't face housing costs. But if you face housing costs, Britain is a disaster.
Okay. I feel we could do a whole,
we should
inquiry on this.
And
we've only got a little bit of time
even more,
today.
We could build some houses, but as well as an inquiry, that'd be nice.
Yeah, I think
on the committee's
2.5 million or something have been built. But Angela.
Well, yeah, that's true. There are 12,000 people on the housing waiting list in Wirral, which is where my constituency is, and 30,000 houses in the social sector. And you can imagine the pressure that everybody is under with those kinds of figures as housing rises up the political agenda, and the Chancellor says very little about it. I wanted to just ask about growth, but before we get there, could you say what impact a plan to abolish employee and self-employed national insurance contributions would have on pensioner taxation if it was funded through an increase in income tax?
Well, if it would cost 40 odd billion to cut national insurance contributions, that would
And that's just for
require-
employees.
Just
but
for
if you're going to get
employees,
rid of it, presumably you'd also get rid of employer national
Well, that would
insurance.
cost you 200 billion or something. I don't think anyone's contemplating that, and it is important to be clear that when anyone talks about getting rid of national insurance, they're talking about only the employee bit, because the employer bit is 3 or 4 times as big as the employee bit now. So if you think it costs you 40-something billion, that's something like 6 pence on income tax if you were to pay for it like that. Now, I think that would be a better world than the world we're in. A world in which we are equalising the tax rate, apart from the employer bit, on earned income and other income, would strike me as being an appropriate place. We'd think it would be a very strange world where we started off with the same rate of tax on all income and then suddenly started increasing it on earned income and decreasing it on other income. So for me, that would be the right thing to do. And yes, it would mean a redistribution from, on average, people over pension age to those under pension age.
Were you surprised to hear it suddenly floated almost as an afterthought in the budget?
I think it's one of many things that were said in the budget that I don't think is going to happen. I don't think there's any prospect of it happening in the foreseeable
It wasn't said
future.
in the budget specifically, was it? No.
Yeah, I think
But it was said. It was said
in the
by the
budget speech.
Chancellor in his interviews post budget. It was also said by the Prime Minister in his interviews post budget. So, Torsten, we have to take it seriously, presumably.
Well, I mean, so it's not going to happen on any plausible timeline. Would it be a better world? Yes, it would be a better world. Not if you're a landlord, but or a pensioner. But generally, that would be a better tax system to have, and I think, and it would make a pretty significant difference to the quality of the tax system. So it's not a small fry.
And do you think income tax would have to go up to pay for it?
It would be an income tax cut for workers of 2p. It would be an income tax increase of 6p if you're a pensioner, or on every pound if you're a pensioner or a landlord.
Those are two reasons why it's not going to happen.
Yeah, pensioners
There are
and
others.
landlords are the ones who are going to have it. But it would be a 6p increase for people who have incomes that aren't covered by national insurance.
I think
2p cut for those who have incomes that are covered by it. So it's just straight in the context of the idea is to abolish this and replace it, pay for it by increases in income tax. It is just a straightforward redistribution from towards people who get their income from work, and away from people who get their income either from wealth or from pensions that would have been saved on from work. It's just a straightforward redistribution between those groups. And then the question is, do you want that? So there's 2 reasons to think about that. One is just, what are your political preferences? We have nothing to say about that, or I certainly don't. The other is, what do we think it does for incentives to work? What do we think it does to those kind of things? In that context, for the same rationale that cutting national insurance contributions, as the Chancellor has done, is something that might be supportive towards the labour market because it encourages people to work, encourages employers to hire people. The continued further 2p cut is effectively what you're getting. You get another 2p compared to the 4p we've already had, but the trade-off for that is you're charging landlords more and charging pensioners more. I think it would be a big change to do all at once, but it's a thing that could be done if someone wanted to do it.
Thank you. And Torsten, how much of the so-called tax cuts that were announced have been paid for or financed by borrowing?
There's a number of different ways of thinking about that. So if we look across the 5 years of the forecast as a whole, we're talking about tax cuts of around £65 billion. So that's the cumulative figure in terms of how much they mean in terms of extra borrowing if nothing else was done. Of that, he has brought back in about a third through raising other taxes. So that's non-DOMs, which I'm sure we're coming on to, slightly extended windfall tax on the oil and gas companies and a few others. So you're about 2/3 borrowing, 1/3 tax rises. Now, that's the decisions. Running the other way, the Office of Budget Responsibility has given him slightly lower borrowing pre-measures than he had back in the autumn. So that's making it show up as no change to borrowing overall in the forecast. But in terms of what the decisions have done, then the decisions are roughly 2/3 borrowing, 1/3 tax rises. It's more tax rise heavy if you're just looking at the final year. But one of the things we're trying to encourage you to do is not just to look at 28, 29 as the measure for everything, because otherwise you could borrow for everything and just fund it in the final year, and that's exactly the problem we're trying to get away from. So that's why I'm giving you the figures in a cumulative over the 5-year forecast.
I think another way of thinking about that is we've got a definite upfront 10 billion tax cut sort of half paid for by an indefinite, uncertain 5-year ahead tax increase, and there really is a lot more uncertainty about what you'll get from non-doms, what you'll get from the energy profits levy and so on, than there is about what the national insurance will cost.
Or indeed how quickly the vape tax will be up and running.
Indeed.
On growth, at the moment we're in a recession, shallow recession, and you were talking earlier about the productivity issues and some of the problems with the UK as an outlier following the financial crisis. Why do you think we have diverged? From the other advanced economies that are similar to ours, is it this combination of the uncertainty over Brexit, the lack of knowledge about precisely what trading would be, or are there some deeper issues as well that you think we ought to be trying to address?
If you make us say one thing, which might make it a quicker answer, then the thing that makes the UK stand out is just low investment. So we have very low public sector investment, not quite as bad today as it has been for lots of other phases since the 1970s. The 1990s was an absolute catastrophe. The 2000s weren't that much better, and lots of topping up that did happened obviously via PFI schemes and the rest. The level of increase planned when Boris Johnson was in number 10 and Rishi Sunak was in number 11 was reasonably, actually quite chunky. It was taking us back to investment levels we hadn't sustained since the 1970s, but they haven't been sustained this time either, so we're coming back down to about 1.7% of GDP. That's on the public sector, and in the public sector, the only G7 economy that comes close to making us look okay is Germany, and anyone that's used German transport or German energy systems will know that there's reasons why that's causing exactly the same problems in Germany as it's causing here. And by the way, that's also because Germany also is the other country that has a very debt-focused rule. Theirs happens to be in the constitution, but the same process is happening, which is pure debt-focused rule is driving down investment levels to cope with day-to-day pressures. On the private sector, no other country comes close to making us look normal. We have, the Germans have very high private sector investment, very low public sector investment. Nobody comes close to how low our levels of private sector investment are. If you do that for a year or two, it's fine. The capital stock is a very large thing. It takes a very long time for changes to feed through. If you do it for decades, which is what we've now done, and this is, again, starts, to your question, Chair, starts before the financial crisis. The private sector investment is coming down in the early 2000s, even when the politics is really stable. That's what I would caution on. The easy thing for economists or for like the CBI or for business leaders who don't want to say this is the problem is to say it's the uncertainty and it's the change that's the problem. Now those things don't help, okay? And definitely we had a very large one in the case of Brexit. But it's not just that. Even when there was very stable politics and very stable economics, the private sector in Britain was not investing anywhere near what you were seeing in other countries. And that is the underlying, so far as a thing we can do something about, as opposed to kind of wishing a financial crisis hadn't happened in a country with a large financial sector, which it's a bit late, then investment is the thing we should be focusing on, public and private.
We have full expensing, people trying to focus on that, but it's still not really making a difference. So is it? You say
we're focusing on it. I mean, so the tax improvements we've made are good over the last 6 months. But remember, some of those, lots of the kinds of investment that happens in Britain won't be able to be covered by full expensing. It's only building stuff and buying machines that we're talking about, really. And secondly, firms are responding to lots of other things, like how active their ownership are. I think you've got to be looking at those kinds of things. It's not about finance per se, which is what everyone talks about in terms of these pension funds, but it is in terms of who owns British firms and how much pressure are they placing on managers to actually have a long-term plan for growth. Because the thing that makes Britain stand out is that our executive teams have basically very little pressure from their owners because they're very diffuse in the sense that they're foreign or they're being held via pension funds, DC pension funds, which are in no way big enough to be active shareholders, and they're probably almost all holding it indirectly via tracker funds anyway. Compare that to the 1990s where you had very large DB pension funds owning large portions of British capital, and then compared to European countries that maybe don't have that block ownership that we normally see in the United States, for example, they have workers on their boards who are providing another form of pressure on managers to have a long-term plan for investment. And if you look at the academic literature on that, it shows you that you don't get, from having workers engaged on boards, you don't get what people worry about, which is wages being higher. What you get is higher investment and higher productivity. So you need some pressure on owners.
I mean, it seems to me that there are several structural issues which have come together there to put us in the least favourable position where the structures that we have, the corporate structures, the ownership of them, the lack of worker representation, Brexit uncertainty, a general disinclination to invest, which goes back to the 70s, all of which have come roaring into presence to create a circumstance where we're now looking at rates of growth that are chronically smaller on trend, rates of trend growth, than they were even in the past.
Yeah, and that's what we've got to get out of. And if you want to know, that's why wages are £14,000 lower today than they would have been if they'd kept growing at their pre-2008 level, £14,000. Because in the long run, if we don't invest, we're not going to be growing this economy.
Did you want to say
Yes,
something?
I just wanted to add a little bit. First of all, I think it is quite possible that we are out of the recession by now, and it was a relatively shallow recession in the second half of last year, so we need to put that in perspective. And also, when we compare growth performance for the UK just in terms of GDP growth compared to the other G7, we haven't done that badly, with the exception potentially of the US. The US has done particularly well, given a number of different elements there that are different. One of them, it wasn't subject to the impact of the higher gas prices, in particular in Europe, that we had here. Obviously, the situation is slightly different when you look at growth of GDP per capita, where we've been a little bit
7
weaker.
quarters of negative growth
Yes,
in GDP
and
per capita, isn't
absolutely, and relative performance there is a little bit weaker. There's other countries, especially since 2019, have done better than us. But generally, I think in terms of the international comparisons, we're not that bad. And then when you look at business investment and private sector investment in particular, I think one of the things that is very important to mention is what we call market size and the expectation of the growth of the market for businesses. And one of the key elements there, apart from the expectation for the growth of the economy, is also the expectation of how much they can export from the UK to other markets. So the relationships, the trade relations are really important here. And
Is that for services or goods, though? Because we've had this 15% reduction in trade volumes, haven't we, as a result of the... So are you talking services?
It is definitely across the board. We had more problems with goods services since Brexit than services, if you like, and we have seen stronger performance of service sector exports, but generally that is across the board as one of the things that will determine future business investment decision. And then apart from that, I would want to stress that uncertainty and longer term uncertainty is extremely important. So changes in government policy, especially on things like climate change policies or investment priorities, are really important, because businesses will look at least a 10-year horizon when they make long-term or important business plans and investment decisions.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. Therese.
Thank you. We may have covered some of this ground already, and it was to do with national insurance. So, people have only seen, two parts of their pay packets improved by the cut in national insurance, and more to come. Now, the OBR and the Chancellor both suggested that there'll be considerably, nearly 100,000 more employees in our economy as a consequence of that. What's your view?
I think that's a plot. I mean, I think what they said was something like that equivalent of extra hours. I mean, that's plausible, but it's uncertain. It's also worth saying that the OBR thinks that the freezing the tax thresholds is going to reduce the number of hours, so there are offsetting effects here. And I think the key thing, in a qualitative sense, reducing national insurance contributions is, if you're going to use the tax system, not a bad way of increasing labour supply, but it's not going to be massive. And as I say, it's offset by other increases in tax elsewhere. I think the 100,000 number is probably the best number you can come up with, but I would treat it with a considerable degree of uncertainty in terms of where we'll actually end up.
In terms of, apologies if you've covered some of this already, I think Mr. Bell, your comments about pensioners have been well advertised, but I'm conscious that you've also, Resolution Foundation has historically pushed a more intergenerational fairness. So I wonder if you could give me a sense of thinking through about how earned income, big tax less, what Resolution Foundation's perspective is on this doing, as you say, the equivalent of nearly 100,000 extra employees.
We're actually producing some more work on that today. It should be going out while we're here, so I can run you through what it says. So it basically says the budget makes not much difference to pensioners because we're cutting a tax that they don't pay. If we look at this Parliament as a whole, so all the tax rises and the tax cuts, then those are the facts that you're mentioning, which show that pensioners do badly because they pay the tax rises but they don't get the tax cuts. That's the £1,000 off 8 million taxpayers. To provide some wider context to that, as you say, on what's the fair thing to do overall, our basic view is if you're going to cut taxes, then the Chancellor's done it in the right way on this generational basis, but also on the fairness versus different kinds of income. And one way of thinking about that is that the thing we've just released shows that if you look at policy changes taken since 2010 in the round, so all of them, the tax rises recently, but also the pension changes taken over the last 10 years before that, then pensioners overall are about £1,000 better off because of the policy changes, including the tax rises recently, because basically that the triple lock provides such a boost to the average pensioner that the loss from the current tax rises is outweighed by that. The only pensioner group that loses if you do the whole period since 2010 is richer pensioners, because for them the tax rises are so large that they outweigh the gains from the triple lock. But it's overall pensioners better off, richest pensioners worse off. And I think that provides a good reason for thinking why what the Chancellor has done in terms of focusing tax cuts on working age households, as well as the reasons we like as economists, which is in general it's a better thing to be doing for incentives and it's a better thing to be doing for horizontal fairness between different kinds of income, is that the history is that policy has actually benefited pensioners overall.
Well, bearing in mind, of course, next month there will be an 8.5% uplift in pensions.
So that's exactly what the numbers are showing.
Yeah, and there has been a significant increase in the number of working pensioners who, of course, don't pay national insurance contributions. The employers do, but not themselves. Is there any kind of assessment on that in terms of whether or not you might anticipate potentially more people coming back into the working environment over that classic pensionable age?
So in general, there's a longer-term trend to having more working pensioners, and one of the reasons why pensioners are now no more likely to be in poverty than the rest of the population, probably for the first time in history, that's not normal. In history, pensioners have been very poor, so they're now less likely to be in poverty than the rest of the population, and one of the reasons, because we all focus on the triple lock, but actually large private pension income is doing a lot of the work, and so is large amounts of earned income compared to what we used to see. That's making a big difference to their living standards. It's obviously a good thing in general for the size of the economy and all the rest, so long as people want to work more over that phase. So yeah, generally a good thing.
In terms of the merger, has this already been covered? The suggestion that on an earned income you have both tax and NI. Because in my part of the world, in a more coastal environment, people often will work weekly in the hospitality industry, so they actually pay more, in effect, than they would if it was done on an annual or monthly basis. So I can see quite a lot of benefits in that. But in terms of several chancellors in the past have looked at merging NI and income tax, and it's never happened. Now, I can give you my own theory for that, but do you anticipate why it's the case that it's proved so difficult? It's a bit like trying to change business rates. That's pretty much never happened either. Despite how many people
council
have looked
tax
at it.
or evidence tax or Aaron, do you want to go?
I mean, I guess the obvious answer is it makes it very obvious how much tax we're charging people, and that's going to be a painful thing to announce that we're going to do it, even if it's the same amount of tax for a lot of people. And then, as we said earlier, the other part is if you were to merge the two things, assuming you want to raise the same tax from the new income tax as you do from income tax and national insurance contributions, those numbers are going to look they're going to be some very sizable increases if you're fully merging the systems, because what we said was just a few minutes ago was it'd be a 6p increase for pensioners if you just do employee NICs. If you do employer NICs as well, then you're really seeing a very sizable increase for pensioners and for landlords, and that is something we should be aware of at least.
NICs have also been the way that people build up their eligibility for benefits and pensions as well, so there's different route on that.
We can probably, I mean, there's already people who don't pay national insurance who we credit into the system, so there's ways we could, if the only barrier was, can we find ways of crediting people into the state pension, then we can overcome that barrier. I think the bigger barriers are the scale of the change and some very hefty losers from the change. But as we were saying earlier, the direction of travel is a good one. The other thing to say is, I mean, I didn't take it as the policy is to abolish national insurance, but if it is, then I'm sure the Chancellor will tell you that tomorrow. I took it as the direction of travel is that it would be desirable to rebalance from national insurance towards income tax. If that's the position, that's a very good thing to have as a stated policy. It is quite similar to my stated policy is that public services should get a bit better over time. As in, it's not, I've got how I'm going to do it or anything. I'm just saying I would like this to happen over time. But, that's no bad thing. And I think for example, if you did want a change like this to actually happen, you probably do need a degree of cross-party consensus so that over a period of parliaments, what you want is an agreement that whenever we're going to increase tax, we'll increase income tax, and whenever we're going to have space to cut a tax, we will cut national insurance, because over time that will get us to a system that actually is the kind of design point, and that would be a triumph. So I look forward to that happening in 50 years.
It is worth saying that until November, exactly the opposite
Exactly, it's the
policy has
opposite
been followed
policy.
by all parties.
So if we can manage a reverse, it's great.
It's the first cut in national insurance, I think, ever. And don't forget, it was only 2 or 3 years ago that national insurance was announced to go up by a penny and a half or a penny and a quarter. So this is actually part of the instability of tax policy that's been so damaging over such a long time.
Well, I recall that was supposed to be linked directly to the increase in money going to the NHS. So
indeed, I don't think NHS has been cut as a result of that. Not happening.
I missed what you just said, sorry?
I don't think NHS funding has been cut as a result of that not happening.
No, I understand. I think I've covered the questions I wanted on NI. I've got some other questions later.
And my understanding of national insurance is it's a regressive tax. Would you all agree with that?
That's what you mean by regressive. So do you mean across the household income
distribution? As a percentage of your income, if you're on a low income, you actually pay a higher tax rate than if you're on a higher income, because it's 2%.
So the marginal rate paid by higher earners is lower than the marginal rate paid by lower earners. I'm not sure that's our best obviously, in terms of thinking through the regressive system, you probably definitely do want to think about it in combination with income tax, where that isn't the case. And secondly, across households, then national insurance, like income tax, is progressive in the sense that it's the middle and the top that pay the bulk of as a percentage of their earnings. And
income tax is more progressive than national insurance. Can I say that?
You can
Would
say
that be a safe statement to utter? Right. Danny.
Great, thanks, Harriet. I think most of my questions are for Arun, but I might just run down the road first for a quick response. Firstly, on the high-income child benefit charge, Torsten. Any reaction to it immediately in terms of raising the threshold? I want to come on to the question of the prospect of the household assessment in a second, but in terms of raising the threshold, do you think that was the right thing to do? And what do you think about scrapping the charge altogether? Would that be neater and better? I'm going to ask the same question to each of you.
Yes, so raising the threshold is definitely an improvement. The existence of the threshold and this way of means testing child benefit is a very bad place for us to have ended up. But there's reasons why we ended up there, but it's definitely a bad place for us to end up. Raising it helps in the sense that as far fewer people are affected, it's quite a big chunky amount of people taken out of the charge, so that's a very good thing. In the long run, yes, we should be looking to get rid of this charge full stop. This isn't a good way to run a tax or a benefit system, and it's definitely not a good way to interact a tax and a benefit system.
You think it would be possible not to award child benefit to certain households, though? Which obviously would be the simplest thing to do. Take it out of the tax system, just don't give rich people the benefit.
So if you want, lots of ways you can try and do that. So at the moment, the Chancellor suggested he obviously wants to move to a household means testing within the tax system. That is quite complicated. It's more doable than it was a decade ago, but it's quite complicated and it's still suboptimal to a degree. I mean, broadly, the system which has a means-tested level of child support within universal credit and then a universal system of child benefit outside that, I think it's not a bad system to have had, and so moving back to that at some point is the way we will remove a lot of the worst high marginal tax rates, but that costs money.
Okay. Yael, do you have a view?
Yeah, I think it is definitely a good move, but I think it should also be aligned with the provision of more and better childcare so that you can bring more people, especially women, to the workforce.
Yes. Okay. Okay, but you would be content to see the charge scrapped altogether, or do you just approve of the raising of the threshold?
Well, given that we have very limited room for public spending, I think we do want to ration it to some degree.
Thank you very much.
I don't have a great deal to add. I think I broadly agree with what's been said. I mean, we are in this bizarre position where we've got universal credit, then we've got a second means test on child benefit. Part of the problem is that the threshold wasn't indexed in line with inflation or anything else from the moment it was brought in, and I think this is just a very good example of why it would be much more sensible if you bring something in, then index the limit rather than leaving it flat in cash terms, which is what's happened. We ended up in this bizarre world where you could get universal credit and have your child benefit taxed away at the same time, which was just kind of I don't think that can now happen, or at least only in very, very exceptional circumstances. So we got ourselves into a heck of a muddle. We sort of moved some of the things around to make it slightly less of an effect, but it's still a muddle.
Okay, love to explore that more. But okay, thank you very much, Arun. Your views, but also particularly on this question of household assessment. Do you think that's practical? Do you think the HMRC is going to be able to do it satisfactorily? Are we just introducing more complexity into the system?
Yeah, so certainly agree on the points we've had already in terms of the value of moving it. In terms of moving towards a household system, I mean, the obvious point is that we already have a household system for the benefit system, and so it is certainly adding complexity to put that within the tax system rather than if the point is we want to deliver something that's means tested and done at the household level, we can do that already, and it wouldn't be HMRC that would traditionally deliver that, it would be DWP. So that would seem the most natural way to do it. If we particularly wanted HMRC to do it, we can do it. One obvious difficulty in the current way we administer it, and that will continue to be hard if we keep a threshold that's around 60,000 rather than above 100,000, is that typically, if you're only an employee, you're not having to file anything to HMRC. You only have to file if you're above £100,000. So either above £100,000, or if you have some income not from direct employment and enough amount of it. So if you have small amounts of savings income, you don't declare it, but if you're over £1,000. So those are the only people who have to file. So if you're not...
Professor, can I just clarify for the record, because I thought the filing threshold had gone up to 150 from 100. Am I not right on that?
It wasn't last year, but it wasn't last year, but it could have changed this year.
It might have just changed.
I think it was announced in autumn for next year.
Yeah.
So just what is
yes, I think okay, that's good.
Okay.
So then even more so. So if you move to £150,000, there'll be even more people who we're saying we don't particularly want them to file pieces of paper or electronic pieces of paper, filling in that they only have one source of income and it is employment income from one place. It does seem complex to add unnecessary complexity to say, but you need to put in some declaration so that you can have child benefit withdrawn.
Yes. Rather
than just to say, okay, if this is something we want to withdraw, we can just do that already within a different system that's designed to do that.
Okay. So as you say, the benefit system and tax credits are administered on a household basis. I mean, I'm instinctively in support of the principle of a household system. I'm just very conscious of the complexity, but also because we don't mean a household as a married household. We just mean people who are in a partnership. Is there going to be all sorts of difficulties in terms of HMRC suddenly having to involve itself in prying into people's relationships? Have we got anything to learn from the benefit system to ensure that system will work?
I mean, again,
but it was an initiative by Mrs. Thatcher, wasn't it, to have
as a general principle, my view...
I'm not objecting to individual taxation. I'm saying there should be the option is...
in principle, I was just going to agree with Margaret Thatcher, which is that generally I would prefer leave taxation at the individual level for a whole host of reasons. You've raised one of them. Yeah. But the marginal incentives to work are also significantly affected for second earners if we move to a household level system. But I have to say, in general, it may also help you reduce poverty in some ways, because you do end up with lower taxation for some poorer households in that route. So, but on balance, I would leave it at the individual level.
Okay, all right. Not forgetting what Nigel Lawson also intended to have transferable allowances between married couples. Never quite did that. Go on. Arun.
Yeah, I mean, currently it's the case that we don't do anything. I mean, HMRC doesn't do anything to try to link members of a couple. There's no reason for them to do so, and so we haven't got any way in which we can currently do that. Yeah. So it would certainly add, just sort of apart from the complexity of trying to design this system, there'd also be a whole new administrative project in trying to link couples. Even at the moment where you can say, oh, I need to have it withdrawn, They don't directly try to link all of those cases and check, cross-check them in a kind of systematic way. So it would definitely create new work that we'd have to be doing on the administration of the tax system if we were then saying we actually want within the tax system to go back to something where there's at least partial household.
Okay, great. I've only got a few more minutes, so I'm just going to come straight to you, Arun, on this question, which is about the non-DOMs, if I may. We had the OBR in this morning. They've described as very high uncertainty, their forecasts on what the receipts would be from this change. Their expectation is that 10 to 20% of current people qualifying as non-dorm would leave the country. It feels they themselves admit it's very, very difficult to predict this. The last change didn't produce much change in the way that people seem to behave. Do you think we can rely on that forecast? Have you got a sense of what the likely effect of this change would be?
There's a couple of things to say. So the first is absolute 100% agree that there's a lot of uncertainty here. There's a lot of uncertainty just first of all in the kind of static estimate of how much money do non-DOMs have abroad. It's just worth pointing out that we choose not only currently not to tax these people, but not to collect any data on what they even have. That's right. Something that wouldn't be true in other countries, where even when you give someone a tax break, you would often collect information about it. So it's worth us thinking about that in terms of the design of the new system, that we should think about what information we will want to have from people who are new arrivals, even if they're not yet having to pay tax on that. Right. Because that will be really important in how we think about administering the system when they start having to pay tax on that foreign income, and us being able to say, well, is that new income or is that old income? So that's one thing. Then in terms of the uncertainty around migration, we think that some people, from looking at the last reform, we think that some people, which was the reform that took place in 2017, we think that the effect of that reform was to decrease the amount of money that people had after tax by about 20%. And the impact of that was to increase the number of people who left the UK relative to what we would have expected anyway by about 6%. Okay. So that's roughly what we see as a benchmark. People who are, and this is on a base of people already having about a 5 to 6% probability of leaving, even when they've been here for 15 years. Exactly. When you look at people who are here for much shorter periods of time, they have much higher probabilities of leaving just anyway. So people who've been here only the last couple of years, typically have a probability of leaving of around 20% for this kind of group. So you should expect a lot of mobility. We should therefore expect that mobility will go up even further. I think you should certainly expect there will be migration as a response to this. Okay. I think the sort of overall number they've come to in terms of the total revenue they think will be raised is pretty close to what we thought as well. They've got there a slightly different way, but we ended up in pretty much the same place. Okay, well that's good to know. All right, so you basically broadly agree. Thank you. Last question, Paul, if I may come to you for a very general point, which is I was struck by what you were saying earlier, predicting that there would be no major cuts in public services and public spending in the next Parliament, whoever's in government, just given the state of things. And you suggest that therefore the consequence would be either higher taxes or higher borrowing to fund current spending or hope for growth. You didn't mention reform and the option for demand reduction with the model we've got. Do you think, what's your experience and your expectation of what might be done in the public sector in order to improve? In a sense, it's about productivity, but it's also simply about the way we deliver services to reduce the overall demand on the taxpayer by shifting spending upstream, being more preventative, being more intelligent about the way we actually spend. Do you hold out much hope for a reform programme to actually help to balance the books rather than just cutting services or increasing spending?
Well, I think there are different aspects of that. So, I mentioned welfare and disability payments, for example, and I would hope that a government will look very hard at how they're delivered and whether there are ways of making savings there, although it has to be said that previous efforts have not been terribly successful for all sorts of reasons. So there is an issue there. Then you look at the big public services. We know that part of the reason, for example, that the health service is struggling with productivity is actually lack of investment in, frankly, just half-decent IT systems rather than using, world-leading AI or what have you, and that's creating problems. So we know that there is, the positive bit here is we know that there is kind of quite low-hanging fruit in some of these big areas, and we really ought to be focusing on some of that low-hanging fruit. And then there are things like moving to student loans, where that's saved quite a lot of public money, but by sort of moving things into the private arena. We might want to ask ourselves, at least, whether there's scope for that anywhere else. It's not very obvious to me that there is, and it will be quite a big It'd be quite a big public political decision to do that in any aspect of health or in any other aspect of education, for example. But that's the sort of place that one might want to look. And then there are aspects of rationing where we might want to think quite hard. Now, one of the problems facing local authorities very clearly is that demand for their services, and particularly some of the very expensive services, has clearly just gone up a lot in recent years, and we might want to understand better than I think we do why that is, and whether there are ways of managing that doesn't simply involve just meeting the demand as it occurs. Although at the moment, again, there is some informal rationing there. People have to essentially appeal against decisions and then get almost 100% success if they do, for example, and that's not a very efficient way of running things. So I think there are a series of options along those lines, and I think we need to take all of them probably quite seriously if we really want to manage the overall size of the state.
Okay. All right. There are others, but I've run out of time.
Yeah, but we may have more time, but I'm going to let John ask some questions first.
Thanks, Chair.
Yeah.
I just turn to forecasting, if I may. I mean, it's a constant theme, as some of you know, with regards to our line of questioning when it comes to sessions like this. Partly driven by the fact that, the forecasts have been somewhat awry, or certainly the dispersion and the accuracy has been somewhat more noticeable than in recent times. We all know Galbraith's quip about making astrologers look useful. But that is a slightly academic point until it affects policy. Now, the OBR notes in box 3.1 in the Economic and Fiscal Outlook, and it has been noted actually elsewhere, that fiscal policy has been volatile in response to forecast revisions. Now, what is to blame? Is it that the forecasts are too volatile, or policy is too closely tied to the forecast?
That's a great question. And I think that discussion is missing from lots of the newspaper-based coverage of what do we think about what's driving fiscal policy. That's really good. So in terms of what we are seeing, there has been a volatile set of forecasts, particularly debt interest forecasts have been very volatile in the recent past. Obviously, go back a few more years, then it's the actual levels of spending that are very volatile. Liz Truss having to announce a huge energy support package, or the pandemic spending itself. So you've got a mix of both. But more recently, particularly over the discussions of the last two fiscal events, the thing that is making policy sensitive to fiscal forecasts is the policy choice to have basically next to no headroom versus a fiscal rule, particularly if the fiscal rule is a long way out and is a hard binary target, going back to our previous conversation. So having so little headroom, the headroom in this budget forecast is about 1/3 of the average headroom governments, chancellors have held since 2010. So it's basically zero, rounding to zero. That if you have that kind of low headroom, then you are going to end up with the forecast having far too much effect on your policy choices, because
with respect, Torsten, I mean, that answers perhaps the first bit, but it doesn't answer the effect. And I'm going to bring anybody else who wishes to answer this about whether policy is too closely tied to the forecast.
The policy is being tied to the forecast because of the policy choice to have so little headroom at the end of each fiscal event. If you left yourself with £40 billion worth of headroom, then the fact that you've lost 15 of it means, well, you just say, okay, well, I'll leave it at 25 this time and I'll recoup it later. And that is exactly what is driving this slightly silly conversation where you have people saying, I've lost £3 billion off my forecast and that's somehow affecting my policy choices, which is an insane way to run a budget.
Any other comments?
There's another part of the problem, which is the response to changing forecasts are asymmetric, in the sense that when the forecasts get worse, chancellors tend to say, well, let's just change our fiscal rules or use up whatever headroom. Not tighten fiscal policy, and when they get better, they loosen fiscal policy. And actually, given the current methodology, if we have another fiscal event in the autumn, then the forecast horizon gets pushed forward another year. So you get if you pencil in another year of tight spending, you probably open up a bit more headroom, and the chancellor can then use that headroom, and that sort of So we have become far too tied.
Far too tight because the finances are tight
for very similar reasons to the ones.
I get that, but is it not worrying that we've got different forecasts for different parts of the machinery of government? Let's take the Bank of England. I mean, we've got the Bank of England suggesting on inflation, for example, that it's going to rebound to 3% plus by the end of the year. You have just, I say you, the OBR has just nearly halved its inflation forecast. So we've got the Bank of England 3% plus. We've got OBR, I think I'm right in saying, at about 1.5 by Q4. It was certainly below 2%.
Yeah.
That is quite a big number, but that's dwarfed when you look at the difference in growth forecasts. I mean, you know, the OBR is coming in at, I think I'm right in saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, 3% ahead of the Bank of England next year, roughly. Now, I say roughly, I mean, it's still a big figure if it's 2.8 or 3% or 3.2. I mean, these are big figures, all right? Now, you've got, therefore, these different forecasts potentially moving fiscal and monetary policy in opposite directions. I mean, that's a nonsense, isn't it?
And that is, yes, although concretely in this particular circumstances, that is a reason why it's probably not a good idea to have put a load of tax cuts in right now, because the OBR is at the most optimistic end of the market. So I know the critique is the OBR, they're so pessimistic, it's stopping kind of adventurous policy changes taking place. But both historically over the whole 15 years of the OBR's life, and particularly right now, the OBR is at the more optimistic end, either relative to what actually happens or on growth this is, or relative to other forecasters. I think the Bank of England comparison is very telling, as you say. If we ended up with the Bank of England's productivity outturn actually happening, then we are a long, long way from debt falling, and you are needing to do tax rises, not to deal with your public services problem, but because you're not going to get debt falling on those numbers.
But thank you for that, Torsten, that's appreciated. But can I just bring in those who haven't spoken yet? I mean, we are leaving ourselves open to that sort of scenario, are we not? Where, you know, because the OBR believes that, you know, growth is going to be far ahead of Bank of England estimates, you've got the OBR in a way encouraging growth, and yet monetary policy could be unduly restrictive because of the bank's particular view. And you need these two, fiscal and monetary policy, not tied to by the hip, but certainly working in conjunction if we get the best out of policy. It doesn't feel that way, courtesy of the forecast of the respective organisations. Am I being uncharitable?
So I think one of the problems is that the mandate that both institutions have is a little bit restricted. So if you take the OBR, for example, they have to take government current policy as a basis for their forecast, and we already know and we've heard that some of that is unlikely to happen. For example, when you look at the fuel charge as one example, and therefore, apart from the productivity assumption, some of the assumptions that they are being asked to use are probably less realistic, or as a private independent forecaster, I would not take those assumptions. And to some degree, you have a similar issue with the Bank of England, where quite a lot of the metrics that they use, for example, the interest rate assumption that they use, the foreign exchange assumption, is based on market expectations. It's not necessarily what an independent focus will have. So that constrained a little bit the focus that you're getting as a result of that. The assumptions are different because of the construction of that framework.
All right. And Professor Advani, do you have anything to add?
I was going to come back on this point about how much it constrains policy. I agree with what Torsten said, that by leaving essentially no headroom, we have to move around effectively with wherever the headroom looks like it's going to be, because we seem to have decided we want to leave nothing, and so we move with the forecast. I think there's a separate point, though, which is, although the OBR has consistently, or recently been optimistic, the optimistic end of market forecasts, if there were a set of forecasts out there where the OBR were looking at the more pessimistic end, a chancellor could, if they felt so minded, say, look, the markets, we don't want to spook the markets, we're not going to go way off base, but here's what the markets look like, here's what the forecasts are. The OBR looks to me pessimistic. I'm going to go for something that looks like I've got negative headroom according to this measure, but I'm accepting that, and I'm telling you why. I'm telling you all why, and the reason is because I can see that everyone else thinks that things are going to go well, and the OBR, I think, are too pessimistic.
Okay.
There's always a scope for doing that, and I think a chancellor, if they really had a credible story, could choose to go and do that.
Yeah. Do you think there's scope for actually not merging, but actually looking to one source, official source of forecasting, perhaps to introduce greater latitude on ranges, so that we all know forecasting is it's hardly a science, is it? In order to try to bring some, how can I put it, not conformity, but some joined up thinking when it comes to monetary and fiscal policy. Because at the moment, from recollection, I can't remember a time when the forecasts have been so different between the two, and you have a real chance here of policies moving in opposite directions at a time when actually we need better coordination between the two policy areas. Why not somehow bring a merger of the institutional forecasting capability?
I think a first step would be to ask them, or I think they actually should just get together and publish something which says, look, here in some detail is why we have come to these different to these different conclusions. I think that would be incredibly useful in terms of transparency. Now, the bank is obviously undergoing a review of its forecasts with Ben Bernanke. I mean, I hope they come up with something which suggests that they show more that they are more transparent and they show more in the way of possible scenarios. And as I said, I think it would be really helpful. Step one, let's have maybe as the OBR does now, it looks back at its forecasts and says, how did we do against them? You could get the bank to do that as well, and you could get the bank and the OBR on an annual basis or at some regularity to work together to explain the differences and explain their models in ways that are relatively clear to non-specialists, including me, about how they do it. I think that would be a good start.
Liaison between the two.
As step one, certainly.
Certainly as a step one. Anybody else?
I think the key is to use scenarios here because, as you rightly say, we are unlikely to get an accurate focus, especially in time when volatility is very high. And therefore, being able to deploy different scenarios and understanding the implication for public finances and spending is very important.
Okay. Final question for you. Oh, sorry, one more very quickly.
Very quickly.
The OBR's forecasting track record is volatile, to say the least. I mean, for example, in Q4, they've almost halved their inflation forecast from, I think, 2.8 to 1.4. That's a big move. I mean, what's your assessment of their forecasting capability? I mean, there's volatility across the piece, but looking to the OBR actually affecting fiscal policy in many respects. What's going wrong?
So my perception, based from a very high level, not being very hands-on involved, would be that they do an excellent job looking at the fine details of potential assumptions and looking at very granular level a lot of different aspects of the forecast. But there's certain things, like for example the assumption on productivity and future productivity, where that is potentially very high level and could be worked at more. And it is crucial assumption really to drive the longer term forecasts.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Advani, can we move to property taxation? The Chancellor maintains that the changes he made to capital gains tax, reducing the top rate by 2%, was effectively going to generate more tax revenue rather than less and enable more first-time buyers to get on the housing ladder. Do you feel that's a justified statement to have made? Do you think that is the likely consequence?
I think there's two parts to that. So the first, the announcement was that his cut from 28% capital gains tax rate to 24% tax rate for owners of additional properties would raise money. He said it would sort of unleash the inner Laffer curve that the OBR had finally found. On that point, what's driving that in large part is the bringing forward of disposals, that people will, the view is that people will sell houses more quickly if the tax rate is lower. They're more willing to just part with it. There's this idea of a lock-in effect, that if the tax rate's high, they've bought a property and we have to pay a big tax on the share, on the gain that's there, I might be less willing to part with that property to go and buy the next one, to swap over if I want to have a different home that I want to be owning. Okay, so this might come down. How
realistic is that as an idea, given people tend to take a view of property, that in the long term it goes up?
So I think the answer is, it's quite hard to know how much it will bring forward people's disposals, whether people will sell more quickly. Yeah. To the extent they do sell more quickly, there won't be additional revenue raised from capital gains tax, because it will still be the case that somebody else will have the property instead. In the end, when you look at the figures, what's driving the fact there's increased revenue from this reform is actually that there'll be more stamp duty being paid. Despite that, it still is clear that by the fifth year of the forecast, these two things have basically netted out. The gain number starting to turn is like getting just to the point where it's On capital gains tax, we're getting no additional revenue, and it looks like we're going to go towards being negative after that. The reason being that at that point, all that matters is we've got a lower tax rate than we had before, and so we're getting less money from capital gains tax.
Okay, but is this going to release then first-time buyer houses?
There's no reason to expect this is going to create more ability for first-time buyers to buy these houses, because this just makes these houses also more attractive for landlords. So I don't see any reason why it would make it easier for first-time buyers at all.
Unless it was going to happen anyway, and it would speed it up. If you think for other reasons, like significant other increases in taxation on second homes, which the government has put in place over the last 15 years, if you think we're in a phase of moving from slightly lower additional property ownership to slightly higher first-time buyer ownership, this could speed it up. To be fair to the Chancellor, but it's raising zero money at the end. It's like,
of course, that then creates more pressure on the rental market. But it's worth saying there is, if you look at the OBR documents, there's it's got one number saying it raises money and one number saying it costs money, depending on which bit of the document you look at. But very small differences at the end. The other crucial thing to say is in terms of rental property, even after this cut, it will remain significantly the most heavily taxed major asset that there is. It's still a really highly taxed asset to hold.
Yeah, you're right. So looking then at the specific change, which is abolishing the furnished holiday let relief, do you think that's going to have the impact that the Chancellor predicts? Because his prediction is, if you level the playing field, more people will effectively go into long-term, if you like, domestic, rented, if you like. But following what's been, an escape from that market by a number because of the proposed renters reform changes, is that realistic? And do we think that maybe there's an unintended consequence? And many of these are small cottages, whatever. Farmers have tried to diversify. They're in the middle of absolutely nowhere. They couldn't get planning permission to make it residential. So actually, you're going to put a great big hole into the tourism industry, which is the last thing that certainly coastal communities like mine could do with.
I think going back to the earlier conversation we had about housing, in a way, some of this is a discussion predicated on how much can we use changes to the tax system to affect where people are living. We can do some of that, but at a more fundamental level, for whatever we've done in terms of houses we have built, the pressure on building houses or building accommodation is still very strong. And if we don't do more of that bit, then we can use the forms of the tax system to change how much is used for holidays, how much is used for private renting versus people being able to buy houses. The core problem here is that housing is really expensive in the UK and accommodation is really expensive in the UK, and that will continue to be the case whichever way around we fiddle the tax system. All that the tax changes are mostly making, except for in this case, are changing the form in which people are able to have access to that, whether it might be that, as Torsten said, you might be able to speed up people moving between renting and ownership. Certainly in this case, if you make furnished holiday lets more expensive, you will presumably encourage, in some cases, some kinds of accommodation where it could alternatively be long-term lets. That will happen. But as you say, there'll be cases where it's not really accommodation of the sort that people want to use for long-term let. And so presumably the answer is either it will go out of the market or people will have to rent it at a higher price and say, well, this is what we're offering it at. And you'll have slightly fewer people taking it up.
Okay, but do you see that might have an impact on the tourism industry?
Going back to the comment about forecasting, I think this is a pretty hard one to work. I don't know if anyone else has got any particular numbers on the scale of this. But
there's not a huge number of these things. My number is 127,000 of these things in the entire stock, which is really quite small. So this is not going to make dramatic. It'll make difference in very specific areas, clearly. But the other thing is here. This is all about moving arbitrary boundaries. So we're going to start treating these lettings more like housing and less like businesses. There'll be a gap. So there's now going to be a kind of boundary between furnished holiday lettings and bed and breakfast, for example, where they'll have completely different tax regimes, and people will try and claim that they offer a little bit of extra service and therefore it should be treated like bed and breakfast rather than like housing. But it's another example, because we treat everything to do with housing, rental housing or lettings or whatever, much more harshly in the tax system than any other business. Then you're creating this gap between wherever you count what it counts as a business and what counts as housing.
When the Office of Tax Simplification looked at this and they talked about the levelling the playing field and getting rid of this particular relief, they were concerned that effectively you had two groups, those which were businesses and those which were, if you like, just a one-off property. And the concern was that if we didn't find a way of distinguishing between the two, we'd just land up with a load of tribunals where individuals running, 5 to 10 different individual holiday lets would say we're a trade and therefore we should have a different tax regime. And they made a particular proposal. Do you think that when the Chancellor looks at it on the assumption he does, implementing this change, he needs to add something rather than just making the two equal, as in rather than just abolishing it, find a way to enable businesses to actually be businesses, because actually they are businesses? I don't know whether, Torsten, you've got any views on that.
I haven't read that Office for Tax Simplification report, so I don't want to comment on that. I mean, I think what he's trying to do is obviously, insofar as you have, I mean, Paul's point is basically the right one, which is you've got like full-on second homes, you've got full-on businesses letting out properties permanently where the owner never has any intention of going near it, and then you have stuff in the middle, and he's trying to put the stuff in the middle into the more towards the second homes category. I think this is a pretty small fry for the economy overall, or even for these markets overall. The general picture is that we are moving to more punitively treat any second or other additional property ownership, and we're doing that because we're looking for ways to change the distribution of who owns our insufficient housing stock. That's what we're doing. I'm perfectly happy to do that given the imperfect situation we find ourselves in. The better situation is to build ourselves enough housing that these trade-offs are far less binding, particularly in certain areas. Going to what the Chair said earlier, we have done a better job actually in some ways of building some more houses over the course of some of the recent years. The problem is that we've just got a very large backlog, and if you look at and we don't need to just keep in line with our population. We need to build significantly above the rate of population growth, because that is what countries do as they get richer, and we for some reason are trying to buck the trend of richer countries consuming more housing, and it's causing us mayhem left, right and centre.
Thank you, Torsten. One final question for you, Yael. Given what we see, and in a way I think what Torsten's saying is it's a political decision, and effectively the decision has been made that we want to try to maximise the opportunity for people to at least have one home rather than two. I mean, ultimately that's the position. But there will be these unintended consequences, because while Torsten says they're a small number, if you happen to have a coastal community, as I do, or a rural one, actually, something like 27% of these are actually in my constituency, apparently. So consequently for them, it's going to have quite an impact, because a number of them simply can't convert it to residential for one way or another. Do you think there would be any justification, given what Torsten said, for the Chancellor to intervene in some way to alleviate that particular issue and try to do something along the lines of what the Office of Tax Simplification suggested?
Well, I mean, just looking at it from a higher level, I'd say the issue that we have with housing at the moment is that we don't have enough housing in where we want agglomerations. So places like London, where we have workers that we want them here because it's more productive to be here. And potentially we have some stock of housing in certain places that is not fully utilized. So it is partially let or is not being used completely and could be used better by other group. So anything that tries to make the whole thing more efficient by building where we need housing and by using the stocks that we have better is better as far as I'm concerned. How to do it within the tax system is not easy. I think the main problem is that things like stamp duty bringing too much money and politically difficult to change. I think stamp duty is probably not the right tax because it discourages people from moving to where they can be more productive and potentially get better jobs. So the whole taxing of the housing stock is probably wrong generally. What we want is to encourage an efficient use of the housing stock and building more housing where they're needed.
Very interesting, and we lament the passing of the Office for Tax Simplification on this committee. I think a few colleagues have got some sort of further quick-fire questions, starting with an exemplar here from Siobhan.
By 2027, 63,250 nurses, 141,827 teachers and 60,680 police officers will have to pay 40% of their earnings to income tax because of the Chancellor's decision to freeze income tax thresholds. In the 90s, almost no nurses and just 5 to 6% of teachers paid higher rate tax. Do you think it's fair for a police sergeant, a senior nurse or a deputy head teacher to pay that amount of money in tax? And is that who the upper tax thresholds was meant for?
Well, it's not who it was meant for originally. I mean, and if you go back to 1990, early 1990s when independent taxation was introduced, the top rate was for the top small number of percent of earners, and I think we're going to be in a position where something like a fifth of earners are paying it. And actually it's the over the 100,000 mark, where you start paying 60%, has become the new top rate. So you've got a very similar fraction of people paying 60 or 45 as you had 30 odd years ago paying 40%. So what we've had actually is just a structural change to the income tax system, which has been brought in gradually. I mean, it's been turbocharged by the recent freezes, but it's been going on for a long time. So we now have what was a sort of single rate tax system with a thing on the top. We've now got a dual rate, two rates and a thing on the top, or kind of a weird thing with 60 and 45. So we've just sort of we have, without announcing it, fundamentally changed the structure of our income tax system.
Do you have, I don't think we need an answer from everyone, but do you have another question, Siobhan?
Yeah. In 2019, the then Prime Minister campaigned on a manifesto pledge not to increase taxes. Since then, the Conservative government has introduced 25 tax rises. The current Chancellor has claimed that this is a tax-cutting budget. But personal taxes are going up, with threshold freezes exceeding the value of national insurance rate cuts by 20 billion. Households will be paying £3,900 more per household in tax at the end of Parliament compared with the start, the greatest tax-raising Parliament since the Second World War. Is the Chancellor being dishonest when he says it's a tax-cutting budget?
It's a tax-cutting budget. It is a tax-rising Parliament. And it is a tax rising phase we are living through, not actually, as everyone keeps saying, because the pandemic and it's expensive and needs paying back, but because debt interest costs are significantly up, and that is what is...
Public spending Parliament, would you say?
It's definitely been a higher public spending Parliament than we used to, yeah.
Okay.
But it's also worth saying that these tax, the reason that this tax has risen as a fraction of national income is mostly not to do with specific choices the Chancellor's made. In one sense, he's been a really lucky Chancellor. He's got loads of additional money in because we've just happened to have very tax-rich growth.
Corporation tax take is a phenomenal for what's coming in the door at the moment.
Thanks. Siobhan, did you have another question?
In order to pay, I'm not denying anybody else the opportunity.
No, go for it.
Just very quickly, in order to pay for the Chancellor's changes in national insurance, the government will have to cut day-to-day spending, as we've discussed, by about 13% or 19 billion. This is 3/4 the size of the cuts we had to endure during austerity. How are these cuts going to be delivered when public services are already on their knees?
We touched on this a bit earlier. I mean, I think that's quite a good way of phrasing it, which is one thing we haven't really had much of a discussion of is, can we afford these tax cuts? Which is, in the end, what's the actual fiscal policy judgment in the budget? It's that we can afford some chunky tax cuts, assuming that we're not motivated purely by the election, which I'm sure we're not. So can we afford them or not?
Yes,
and then the question is, and there's two proof points that the answer is probably no, we can't afford these. One of them is what you've just read out, which is public service plans, which won't be sustainable. And so we're hoping we get lucky. And it'd be better to get lucky then have the tax cut than pencil in the tax cut and then hope we get lucky. So that shows it's not affordable. And the second thing is that the fiscal policy of both main parties is they would like to see debt declining. As you asked at the beginning, Chair, we'd like debt to head back down to levels that we saw in the past rather than the rise we've seen in future. And we're just not going to on these forecasts. So in a world where you're not getting the debt decline you say you want, and you've penciled in public spending cuts that I think most people agree can't be delivered, you can't afford the tax cuts you've just announced.
Thank you. Therese.
Our chairman asked OBR earlier, what would it generate to return to pre-pandemic levels of public sector productivity? And the suggestion was tens of billions of pounds. So in terms of the trying to improve public sector productivity and productivity more general, what is the one or two main policies that you would encourage the government to really press in trying to make that change?
Yael.
So I think this is really important because it cannot just be about spending. I think planning long term and really assessing what needs to be done and not chopping and changing and going through consistent plans is also very important here, because we will have shortage of money, so we need to do the best with whatever investment money that we have. So procurement, good procurement system, and long-term planning of what is needed before you start with anything on the ground.
In terms of, I don't know if anybody else wants to add a little bit more on that. It suggested earlier things like IT or artificial intelligence could have a significant role. Is technology going to be enough? You talk about longer-term planning. I guess the government would point to a 10-year plan for workforce or whatever. Never been one of those before. But any other thoughts?
I mean, if you're talking about public service productivity, of course, the health service is more than 40%. So a focus on that is really important. And I spent a year on the Times Health Commission, and I mean, two or three things just really struck home very hard from doing that. One is that far from cutting edge or AI technology, I think I said earlier, they just need half decent technology rather than computers that take half an hour to turn on and information systems that don't talk to each other and so on. So there needs to be an absolute focus on the basics of having an IT systems that work. Second, the stories of just poor management of people are astonishing, and again, that has to be quite a big drag on productivity. So it's not as exciting as AI and new technology, but the fundamental management of some of these things strikes me as being absolutely vital. And then there are things where you can use AI. I mean, if you're doing diagnostics, you don't need two consultants a radiologist to look at it. An AI plus a radiologist, probably more accurate and certainly cheaper. So I mean, there are things that there are things there that you can do, but it's really hard to do this with big sort of things from the centre. I mean, this is about making it work, making, as Yael was saying, making the procurement work, making the management work, getting the basics of the IT right. And I'm definitely not the right person to ask about how you do that, because I think that's really hard.
I told the committee earlier the story of how NHS Digital wouldn't give information to the NHS leadership, and it's just ridiculous.
Well, they won't give information
their merger was accelerated. But going on a little bit further, I mean, we've got unemployment still exceptionally low. Economic activity not as high as perhaps we'd like, and some of the policies the Chancellor, which we will interrogate tomorrow, is intended to do some of that. But if you go back to other aspects of productivity, why do you think there wasn't such a big take-up of the super deduction? Probably one of the most generous tax policies ever. We now have full expensing. What's going to make the change to try and get that?
Well, I think a big part was the overall climate of uncertainty and policy uncertainty in particular that made investment weaker. So I think when you look at what drives investment, it's not always just the cost of it. It's also just understanding the overall projections of what the benefits and what the actual environment would be.
What sort of uncertainty? Because there's no doubt all political parties would like to see more growth. All political parties would like to see more investment by the private sector. So help me understand that more.
So if you think about, for example, if you look at energy policy, for example, or infrastructure, the fact that we have changes in the planning or for the transport plans, energy regulations. There's a lot of unknown for a lot of sectors within the economies that would want to invest when they know this is what the direction is going to be. Part of the issue is that we have a 5-year cycle of Parliament, so that doesn't help in that sense, and it's not something we want to potentially change. But
You're
suggesting we should abolish democracy.
It's overdone this voting thing.
I expect you to get less of an important.
No. I think within that, I think
of a productive economy if we abolish democracy.
I think
really, you mustn't include things like political cycles in uncertainty.
I think within that, it's already been mentioned today, there's certain things that are cross-party that a consensus on what's good for the country will be beneficial, that will give businesses greater certainty in the longer term. So there's certain things that are of interest to the whole country, like improving productivity, where you could have a productivity commission that would recommend what measures will be beneficial or what kind of investment will make sense in the medium term for the good of the country, that would potentially give businesses more certainty as to where the direction is going to be.
But you agree that abolishing elections isn't the way to do it?
Absolutely
But
not.
I think it's important to say, though, that it's not just about political uncertainty between parties. It is also, over this Parliament, we had an Industrial Strategy Council, and we had an Industrial Strategy, and then we abolished it. We created a Skills and Productivity Board during this Parliament, and then abolished it after 18 months. We've changed direction a couple of times on what the view is over climate change and net zero. Now, whatever your views are on any of those things, so whatever your views on any of those things, whether we should be doing things about climate change or shouldn't, if we pick a direction, at least businesses can say, okay, we've decided, as was announced yesterday, we're allowed to go more for gas. We could say, okay, we're going to focus on clean energy. I have views on which of those I would rather do, but if we don't decide and commit to it, even within the length of the Parliament, let alone a cross-party consensus on these things, we're really going to struggle. So I think the lack of certainty, even within a Parliament, is a real constraint.
So, Advani, I don't think you can say that there's been a change on achieving net zero by 2050, or indeed any particular change by 2030.
It is the law, and actually, there's an example of fiscal targets, or of a target that we have that we're not particularly on track to meet. If you look at the Climate Change Committees, you'll have more to say about Climate Change Committee, having been on it, but if you look at our progress towards our targets, sure, we have a target for 2050, but what matters is not just what do we think do we think we're going to, a bit like the 5-year ahead rule that we have for fiscal targets, where currently we're sort of saying, well, stuff will happen, but between year 4 and year 5, that's when everything's going to happen.
It's still on track, including the one by 2030, because already a lot has been done. Now, I can understand why people would say, you might want to go further and bank what you've already got.
Our current policy
keep to that, but that's not keeping us off that. But
probably don't have going into time to go into a heated long-term discussion on.
But we're talking here about. Don't want people to get the impression,
Professor. Yeah.
So in terms of one other aspect that could be, other economies have far higher unemployment and much higher productivity. Do you recommend that we should do that as a policy?
Certainly not.
Okay. And then in terms of some of we talked quite a lot about housing. I know that the amount spent now through housing allowance is well over £30 billion a year and predicted to rise. Do you think the government should take perhaps more radical things on housing and, for example, do a development corporation for London? Because the current mayor of London just simply isn't building enough houses.
The general thing, which is often people look at the symptoms of the housing problem and say, can we try and stamp on those? And you've raised one of them, which is the increased spend on housing benefit, which you regularly see people saying, that's bad, let's stop spending the money on housing benefit and spend it, say, on building houses tomorrow, missing the point that there's a reason why we're having to spend the money on housing benefit, which is the housing costs have gone up too much and we're having to cope with the consequences of that. So yes, we do need to build more houses. In terms of how you do that, there's lots of different things we could do, but the original proposals from Michael Gove in terms of binding targets would have made quite a material difference. If alongside of telling councils they had to accept building targets, you gave them the ability to control that more. There's elements of the Levelling Up bill that you've just passed that allow councils in some circumstances to take land at use value rather than hope value so that they can actually get on with building some more affordable housing or the infrastructure that you require to do that well. Extending that to basically allowing councils, if you're going to force them to build, to be able to control it and do it in that way would make a big, big difference. And as you say, some of our largest urban areas, not just London, but around London, could make a big contribution to that. But we've had people opposing a planning application to turn a car park next to Cockfosters train station into lots of homes because apparently the car park was the most single important amenity for the local community. We had people campaigning against a tree in East London where there's a mulberry tree that can't be knocked down to build. In the end, if you want the housing situation sorted, people are going to have to stop blocking housing because they are stuffing the next generation.
I don't expect you to...
Technical term.
that is what we've been doing for decades.
Well, there's a combination of factors, isn't there, that people are living longer, so aren't necessarily moving out of their homes.
They're not going to.
More and more households are forming. as people split up as well, and also the impact of migration.
And we're not building enough
although we're
houses,
not,
which
really,
is the most staggering.
It is, but
one.
really interestingly, we are not splitting up as
the Mayor of London actually.
we're not splitting up the rate we would probably be expecting people to split up. Like divorce rates are down. One of the reasons divorce rates are down is good luck paying for your 2 houses on the salary you were before. And we'd be expecting to see more single households. Actually, one of the suppressed households we're seeing is not enough singles turning up in the numbers because they can't afford to do it.
Correct. So can I also just ask, perhaps Mr. Johnson could send me or the committee a note. Earlier you mentioned the evidence of GPs not referring people for treatment, which is really concerning, because I know aspects of waiting lists will vary. Just getting your next appointment already means you're automatically on the waiting list. Of course, there are plenty of people not being treated, but I'm concerned to hear that you're saying GPs aren't actually referring people.
You simply see that by the fact that the number of referrals hasn't grown as the number of people turning up at GPs has grown. So this is a sort of, again, a
You're making a correlation rather than
there's a
known
correlation
evidence.
there.
Okay, all right. Because there are the diagnostic centres, but again, there's a mixed picture because not all GPs are choosing to refer to diagnostic centres. They're choosing still to refer them to hospitals as well. So there's quite a complicated thing. So I was just checking if there was some specific evidence out there, but it's correlation.
It's just
Thanks.
looking at the number of referrals.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have just one more
Thanks,
question
Joe.
from John.
Can I just return to productivity as a matter of interest? I mean, I think all of us right here, I would assume, think unemployment is a social evil. I certainly do. I think it's corrosive in society, etc., etc. Now we have an economy that, as Yael suggested, hasn't done as badly as some people believe, but in terms of GDP growth. But we have an economy that has record employment, or near record employment, an unemployment rate well below, say, the EU average. And we know it's not just about unemployment, it's about how well people feel off in their pockets and standard of living issues as well. But if I had to choose between low unemployment and slightly higher productivity, now I know there's a correlation between the two, and I'm not undermining the importance of productivity, I would choose lower unemployment, because for all the reasons I've just said. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and this is a question I don't know the answer to. If we were to, for whatever reason, allow unemployment to rise, productivity would increase as well, would it not? Because you'd be measuring those in employment.
There's obviously a long literature on the trade-off between unemployment and productivity. In the short run, if you saw a small rise in unemployment, would it push up arithmetically the average productivity? Then probably the answer is yes, because generally, on average, people exiting the labour market tend to be below average productivity. I would just caution slightly about taking that to its longer term conclusions, because obviously that argument tends to run, I'd rather be us than France, where they have higher levels of unemployment and much higher productivity. All I would say is France isn't the only country that exists in the rest of the world. Lots of countries manage low levels of unemployment and much higher productivity, and that is the world we should be aiming for. And in the long run, the trade-off between productivity and unemployment is not and there's other reasons why, for example, France has high unemployment. It's not because their productivity is high, it's because they have a two-tier labour market where they basically lock a load of people out of work, as you see in some other southern European countries. I don't think it's because of the high productivity, but I agree, in the short term, yes, arithmetically that is a relationship.
We'd still be worse off on average. I mean, if you make people unemployed, we are worse off on average, even if the average among those in work is high.
No, I would completely agree with you. I mean, as I said, if I had a choice, I'd choose employment over productivity, although I realise there's a correlation in the long term, probably with regards to prosperity and unemployment generally.
I think it's all about capital stock. So if you have less people at work and you have more machinery, then they will become more productive per person. But then that's really the short-term bit of it. If you increase the people in the labour force, you will also increase investment and capital stock to accompany that gradually, and productivity should rise as well, provided you've got enough people to sell your products to.
Can I just if I may, Chair, minimum wage rising ahead of inflation, that I firmly believe in for a whole host of reasons, because if we're going to have a high or higher growth, high wage economy, then that's a stepping stone in the right direction. There is some evidence to suggest that, big business in particular has relied on cheap labour as a substitute for investment. What importance do you attach to that higher growth in the minimum wages as one step, it's not going to be the only answer, as one step of encouraging better investment, which in turn should lead to better productivity?
I think it's mixed. I think it would potentially encourage two things: the substitution of labor with machines, but also upskilling people if you have to pay them more, and trying to retain them.
That's a good thing, isn't it?
Exactly. So generally it would be positive, but you need to take into account also affordability. So certain sectors, for example, social care is a good example where the ability for them to then push up the cost is limited and something else gives.
Okay.
As
Anybody
a
else?
result.
Torsten?
This is a big topic. So on just generally, I broadly agree on the intuition you're flagging. In the long run, a higher minimum wage should lead to different business models. That if the minimum wage was being enforced, then you wouldn't be seeing hand car washes charging very low rates because they're obviously underpaying the minimum wage, so you would replace them with machines. That's certainly true. In aggregate, the minimum wage has obviously risen a lot. Someone on the minimum wage today is earning £9,000 a year more, a full-time worker, than they would if the minimum wage was still at its 99 level in real terms. So it's a huge increase we've seen there, and a very, very good thing. On how it boosts productivity, in terms of the evidence, we haven't seen maybe as much as we would like in terms of forcing. I think we think about it as I put up the minimum wage, and the firm that currently employs that worker invests in machinery as well. And the evidence, I think that will happen to a degree, but the evidence isn't strong that loads of that has happened in the UK because prices have gone up.
I would suggest not just in machinery, but in that investment.
We haven't seen lots of that, but I still think the jury's out. Secondly, though, there's another way in which it boosts productivity, which you have seen in the German case, where they've introduced the minimum wage in 2015 or 2016, and it's that you basically move workers out of poor performing, low investing firms who can't afford to pay those wages, and they move into faster growing, higher investing firms. And I think that the evidence does show that has happened, and that's a very, very good thing. It's another reason why we shouldn't always be wanting to protect the existing firms. We should be wanting to get people out of some of our bad performing firms into good firms. If the bad performing firms close, that is how Britain gets richer in the long run.
Thank you very much, and we come to the end of the session, but just before we finish, is there anything else that any of you wish to say that you haven't had the chance to assail us with before you leave? Okay, thank you very much. That concludes the committee's evidence session this afternoon. Thank you very much to all our witnesses, as always, and we'll reconvene tomorrow afternoon to hear evidence from the Chancellor. Thank you very much. This session is now at an end. Order. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.